May 1940. The Germans move west. Hitler's aim is to crush France. Alongside the regular German army is the Waffen-SS, Hitler's political soldiers.
Our guiding principles were duty, loyalty, honor, the fatherland, and comradeship.
They are not like other soldiers.
They got no kindness towards your man at all, don't matter, or man or woman or child. They kill everything in the mist.
Their motto, to accept death and to hand out death.
Death was actually almost commonplace for them, the idea that they would die, but also the brutal attitude they had to killing.
They are supposed to be warriors of world perspective. They are considered the elite in Hitler's Reich. The image is attractive to many.
The first reason was that after being an officer in the Hitler Youth, it was natural to join the SS. The second was that all my ancestors had been officers in Guards regiments. So it was obvious that I would want to join the bodyguard division.
Hitler's bodyguards. The bodyguard division Adolf Hitler becomes the core of the Waffen-SS. To be accepted in this division is an honor.
When I got the letter saying I'd been accepted, I ran all over town, just delighted that they had taken me, because there were 80 men who applied to join, you see, and they only accepted 3 or 4 of us. The others were only allowed to join the army, but not the Waffen-SS.
The Waffen-SS offers fine prospects of promotion, and, it is claimed, a secure career. Kurt Sammetreiter was unemployed before joining.
So one day I went to see my father and said, "Listen, how would it be if I joined the SS? I'll be in for 4 years to serve my apprenticeship, and then I'll be qualified for the civil service." "God forbid," he said. Perhaps he knew a bit more about the whole thing than I did. But in the end, I had my way. I told him I'd be back in 4 years, qualified, and I was off.
But the SS is not the place to qualify for the civil service. Himmler wants a powerful force that will always show unquestioning loyalty to him in any battle, against internal as well as external enemies. They march to the front under the command of the German army. But regular soldiers are suspicious about these Nazi party troops.
The army had repeatedly been reassured by Hitler and the generals that it was the only armed force representing the German state. And now it was quite clear that a force was being built up alongside the army, which would compete with the regular army for power.
At this point, the Waffen-SS still does not play a major military role. But even in France in 1940, it begins to fight a pseudo-religious war.
We would come across Adolf Hitler's bodyguard division and the motorized regiments of the SS, and they used to leave signs behind for the rest of us to find. That's how we knew exactly who had been there before us, the bodyguard division. They had destroyed all the crucifixes in Catholic France. It was obvious, even aggressive paganism on their part, but at the time we didn't realize it.
Their religion is blood and soil, part of Hitler's insane racist creed. War is declared on all other faiths and those that practice them. An SS man who later becomes a priest remembers the insanity.
One day, a big shot from Berlin came to speak to us. We were stunned by what he said, but we weren't allowed to tell anyone. It was strictly confidential. This man told us that victory could only be complete when all the churches were destroyed. Not only the Jewish religion, but also all Christian faiths would have to be eliminated. Christ is an illegitimate son of a Jewish female. That was the official description of Jesus Christ, you see.
The claims of a new cult that aims for universal victory. Waffen-SS soldiers against the background of Rotterdam in flames. Propaganda fosters the image of invulnerability. The pictures fail to show the high losses inflicted on the Waffen-SS. Commanders like Sepp Dietrich have been SS men since the early days, but they are novices in military terms.
Naturally, his abilities as a commanding officer were not respected because he had no training in military tactics at all. He had been a sergeant in the First World War and had never had the benefit of advanced military training since then.
Beginners, but devoted. Without regard for its own losses, the Waffen-SS pushes forward. What they lack in military skills, they make up for in sheer brutality. When Waffen-SS continues on the History Channel. A blitzkrieg against France. It can only be a matter of days before the country is defeated. The British, fighting alongside the French, also retreat. They fall back to Dunkirk. What remains of the British force tries to board ships that will take them back to England. A handful of elite troops attempts to cover the retreat. One of them is Albert Evans. He is 19 years old at the time.
Because the people was getting off the beaches of Dunkirk, we was told that we'd got to hold our position at all costs, like, you know, so we held it as long as we could.
On May 28, 1940, Albert Evans and the rest of his unit are encircled in Wormhout by the SS bodyguard division Adolf Hitler.
Then they lined us up at the end of a gable end, and they got the machine gun on the road.
They weren't very pleasant people to meet at all, none whatsoever. I mean, our officer pleaded with the Waffen-SS, and he said, the point of where you're going is a point of no return.
We was put into a field, and they put us into a barn, and that's when they started calling 5 out. They shot 5 first, then they called another 5 out, shot them. Then chaps were getting a bit edgy, and the next thing I seen the Jerry bending down, taking a grenade out of his boot and slinging it in.
Whether I caught the blast of that grenade, I don't know. But as I fell to the floor, the officer grabbed me, this arm, and come on, Evans, he said, run for it. And we run out the barn, round. And of course they got 4 of their men up the side of the barn and they fired at us. The captain who saved my life and got killed in doing so. I must have stood up and I got hit in the shoulder. It was only a stray bullet, but I was all right. I was bleeding from my arm, bleeding from my shoulder, bleeding from my neck. I still struggled and I made me get away.
Albert Evans and Alfred Toombs managed to escape. 85 of their companions lose their lives in Wormhout. During that week, a total of 185 British prisoners of war are murdered by units of the Waffen-SS.
What happened to us, I don't think, didn't come under the annals of warfare. It was a cold-blooded murder. I think so, myself.
Their commanding officer, Sepp Dietrich, hands out medals to the men of the Waffen-SS. Their reward is a trip to Paris. They pose for the newsreel cameras. Now they are officially heroes.
We were glad it was over, really glad. We were so glad that for days on end, we drank ourselves into a stupor, to be frank. I mean, we wanted to forget it. We just wanted to forget what had happened.
Members of the SS bodyguard division trying to forget. This footage is not intended for the newsreels. In contrast to these images, which are intended to attract new recruits, even in the countries that have been occupied. In Belgium, Holland, Denmark, and Norway, Himmler arranges for local volunteer Waffen-SS units to be assembled. The Germans enlist recruits by playing to the racist and anti-communist feeling that also exists in these occupied countries. But some volunteers also consider this their best option to secure as much independence for their lands as possible in Hitler's new Europe.
The vast majority of volunteers took the step they did firstly because the Flemish leaders called upon men to volunteer for this fight against the Bolsheviks. But it was also an attempt to ensure that Flanders would get a fair place in the new Europe.
More and more recruits from the occupied zones in the West sign up to join the Waffen-SS, as do thousands of what the Germans designate ethnic Germans from the Balkan nations. They don't know what to expect.
We didn't have the faintest idea about German military service, the way the army was run, the drill and so on. The drill, the brisk manner, the inflexibility and the almost inhuman attitude was a deep shock to us.
In the barracks of the Waffen-SS, adolescents are to be turned into fighting machines.
The training really was tough and strict, and I suppose you could say the methods they used were sometimes extremely brutal. Not everyone was able to stand it. There were some who wanted to get out, and the only way they could do so was by killing themselves.
They are trained to be tough and ruthless. They are trained to obey. There is no place for weakness. They are supposed to be military athletes. They are hard on themselves as well as on others, trained by former army officers like Felix Steiner. Along with the military training is ideological indoctrination.
Naturally, we were schooled in ideology too, especially later at the Jugendschule, where we were taught the principles and the ideas of National Socialism. And as an elite force, we were actually quite proud of it. It was part of the vocation of being a soldier.
The Junkerschule in Bad Tolz, founded by a former German army general, Paul Hauser, is an elite school for the leaders of SS squads. Here, the killers are men of principle. His trainees learn techniques, tactics, and the correct image of the master race. Only their comrades are regarded as equals.
As far as we were concerned, every European who fought with us was our equal. There weren't any differences anymore. Yes, I had German soldiers under my command, and they had to obey me even though I was Flemish, and it wasn't a problem at all.
Tens of thousands of volunteers from Western European countries joined to fight the Soviet Union. Many of them in the SS Viking Division.
I think, looking back, that there was a very strong spirit of comradeship, which was based on the same fundamental attitudes, you might say. Part of this was the conviction we felt that we were fighting a just war, and the conviction that we were a master race. We were the best of the master race, and that certainly binds men together.
A war of extermination is unleashed on the Soviet Union when the Waffen-SS returns. On June 22, 1941, Germany invades Russia.
On the third or fourth day, we were sent over the border, not far from Brest-Litovsk, past Brest-Litovsk and into the forests. And from then on, we just kept on pushing them back, the Russians.
The vast country is to be crushed in just a few months. A war of extermination, the likes of which has never been seen before. Over half the Russian prisoners of war are either shot or die of starvation. The SS do not consider their prisoners fellow soldiers.
Da ist eine Reihe von russischen Soldaten, also offensichtlich Gefangene.
There was a whole group of Russian soldiers, prisoners of war, and they had been lined up by an SS squad, and apparently the SS men were just getting ready to shoot the prisoners.
Diese Kriegsgefangenen zu erschießen.
The SS sergeant said, "Oh, First Lieutenant, they're just subhumans." And that seemed to be typical of the ideology of the Waffen-SS, and also for the system that operated there. A non-commissioned officer, a sergeant, took the decision to shoot prisoners of war who were not armed and so on, simply because it suited him at the moment to have them shot.
An SS man and his prisoners. Only one left is the caption written under this photograph. But the SS is not alone in committing war crimes. The German army commits similar war crimes. A war of extermination is waged on the civilian population. Pictures of Soviet atrocities, like those that took place in Lemberg in 1941, are used as propaganda to stir up hatred. An eyewitness recalls a massacre by the Waffen-SS in Borisovo, near Moscow.
In Borisovo, 25 people were arrested immediately. The village activists, the head of the collective farm and his deputy, as if they were going through a list. A mass grave was dug straight away, and the SS men said, "They are partisans."
Borisovo is occupied in October 1941 by troops of the SS Das Reich division.
When the Germans gave the command to fire, the son of the head of the collective farm, a little boy, screamed out, "Father, I won't let them take you." They shot him as well.
Just a few weeks later, Hitler's Blitzkrieg founders. The Russian winter takes command of the operation. Neither the German army nor the SS is prepared for the cold.
I saw how some comrades got frostbite and their ears would drop off. So my men and I, we all tied cloths around our heads to bind our ears to our heads.
The counterattack. At the gates of Moscow, Stalin sends well-equipped Siberian troops to fight the German army and the Waffen-SS.
We attacked the Germans and we caused them huge losses. Our morale improved at once. We were absolutely delighted that we had been able to send the legendary SS packing.
The first big defeat suffered by the SS, and the end of the legend that they are invincible, a legend that they had until then believed themselves.
The word retreat was dishonorable. It was not part of our vocabulary. So for us, it was as if we had started something and failed, acted wrongly. We were stunned, absolutely stunned. Physically and psychologically, we were wrecks.
December 1941, the first turning point in the war.
It was precisely this counterattack outside Moscow that convinced us we were capable of winning the war. We had been in battle against the German SS division and we had beaten them. We were fighting for our homeland, while the Germans were on foreign soil.
On this foreign soil, the Waffen-SS is deployed where the fighting is most fierce, as front firepower. Thus, they come to be increasingly valued by those who had previously shunned them, the German army.
If you were in charge of a division, you felt quite reassured to have a Waffen-SS division fighting at your side, because they were outstanding soldiers, extremely courageous soldiers, and in general they were better equipped than the regular forces. So you felt far more secure if you could rely on a Waffen-SS detachment on your flank.
To accept death and to hand out death. In Russia, the Waffen-SS comes to live by its motto.
When we were to fight SS units, we were expressly warned about it. Comrades, they would say, you are to march into battle against the SS. Be on guard. Take every precaution. They were real suicide soldiers. As long as there was one of them left alive, you knew they would continue to fight, right to the bitter end.
The Waffen-SS suffers heavy losses, but no worse than the German army units. When it comes to dying at the front, the differences matter less. SS medical orderly Rudolf Porsche.
When I'd see young comrades in their beds in the mornings, dead, all curled up like hedgehogs, I'd often think to myself, if your mother could see you here now.
Hitler counts on the Waffen-SS once again. His men are to secure victory for him after the defeat of Stalingrad. They attack Kharkov, one of the biggest cities in the Soviet Union. Soldiers of the bodyguard division Adolf Hitler are the first to enter the metropolis.
There was a foolish saying, the bodyguard division saw it as their main task to bring the city of Kharkov to his knees for their Führer. And that motivation did exist, let's not try to deny it.
Another city falls victim to the war, but the victory is short-lived. Hitler's bodyguard division has higher losses here than on the battlefields of France. A Pyrrhic victory.
90% of our Panzer division was wiped out.
90%.
Hitler's newsreels keep quiet about the German casualties and the mass murders. Pictures taken after the Soviets reconquered Kharkov. Evidence of a massacre at a military field hospital. A doctor, Yevgeny Katkov, was a witness.
SS soldiers threw fire grenades in at the windows. The whole place started burning and the wounded men tried to get out to save themselves.
In vain. Many of the wounded are burnt alive. April 1943, Himmler visits Kharkov, welcomed by SS Chief Squad Leader Hauser. This is the war that the head of the SS wants, and he is full of praise.
Wir haben nur eine Aufgabe, diesen Rassenkampf erbarmungslos zu führen. Diese ausgezeichnete Waffe des Schreckens und des Terrors, die uns vorausgeht, nach dem Sieg von Kharkov, niemals schwach werden zu lassen. sondern sie nur noch zu verstärken. Meine Damen.
A French village massacred, and the SS Youth Division joins the fight when Waffen-SS continues. On June 10, 1944, a regiment of the SS Das Reich Division sets off for the village of Oradour in southern France.
In the morning, you have breakfast with your family. By nightfall, the family is dead. And there's nobody else left either. No houses, nothing.
The inhabitants of Oradour have been hoping to be liberated by the advancing Allies. The Western Allies had landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944. It is time for people to rise up against the occupying forces. In many places, there are attacks by the resistance. The Germans fight back in every way they can. For some SS men, what happened in Oradour was nothing special.
Oradour? Yes, some of us go back there from time to time. I've been thinking of making the trip myself, yes. They're given a warm welcome, even people who are in the Führer regiment.
But in 1944, Oradour-sur-Glane is to pay for recent attacks by the resistance. The Waffen-SS herds the inhabitants into the market square. The men are separated from the women and children.
I said goodbye to my mother and my wife. I embraced them one last time, and then we watched as the SS led them into the church.
The women and children are locked inside the church. The men are taken into a barn, and the SS men open fire on them.
They are out of their minds, I thought. Out of their minds. In the first salvo, I got 2 bullets in my lower leg. And then I fell and got 2 more bullets in my thigh. All my friends fell on top of me. That's what saved my life. They saved my life.
Then the village is burnt to the ground.
Fire is a terrible thing. So I decided to make a run for it. I was quite convinced I was going to die because they were right there at the door. But I would rather have died by a bullet than in a fire.
The fire that Robert Hébrard and Marcel Dartout were able to escape kills the women and children of Oradour. Almost all of them die in the church where the SS imprisoned them.
My father came up in tears and said there was no point looking for anyone, because they were all dead. That was terrible.
The ruins of Oradour. They remain a memorial and an open wound to this day.
You know, the wounds to your body heal, but the wounds to your soul, they will never heal for the rest of your life.
While Oradour burns to the ground, between Caen and Saint-Lô, the battle for Normandy rages. Here, the SS Hitler Youth Division is fighting. They are the youngest of the SS units. According to legend, it is entirely composed of volunteers.
Many of them had been forced to enlist. They had applied to join the Luftwaffe or whatever, and then ended up there.
Axmann, the Reich youth leader, wanted to give Hitler a present, a new SS division, 20,000 children for the war.
When the division was formed, we didn't like the name at all because it sounded too childish. We wanted to be real soldiers. Although the youngest of us didn't get any cigarette rations. They were too young to smoke. Instead, they got sweets, sweet rations.
They were dubbed baby soldiers by the Allies. Still almost children, they felt like soldiers. deluded to the very end.
They were fighters, really. A lot of them fought right to the bitter end. They wouldn't give up.
And a large number of them still believe in final victory.
When we got some of them, I remember them marching down a group of prisoners going by me, and one of them yelled to me, "Oh, it's all according to plan. We were permitted to let you come ashore and get in, and then we're to shove you back into the channel." It wasn't until much later that they realized that things weren't going their way.
The fighting in Normandy ends in a catastrophe for the Waffen-SS and for Sepp Dietrich's bodyguard division Adolf Hitler.
There weren't any units left. All wiped out. No units left. No tanks left. It was up to every man to try to make it back by himself. All of a sudden, it was all over. It was chaos. The whole thing.
The air forces of the Western Allies relentlessly attack what remains of the Waffen-SS and the German army in Normandy.
Enemy air superiority was so overwhelming. Now you will ask, didn't it occur to you at that point that it was useless to continue fighting the war? Well, at the time, it was a question you didn't ask.
Though the war has long been lost, now the youngest are driven to fight.
When they came back from a mission and only half of them would be left, they looked just awful. Their faces were gray, they were terrified, and yet they would still be ready to fight. If someone gave them the order, they would go back out there again.
Obedient to the death.
One young chap died in my arms. I had to close his eyes and I howled like a baby, and he said to me, "Sir, please ask my company commander to write to my mother and tell her I died like a brave soldier, believing to the end in my Führer and my fatherland."
Himmler, head of the SS, encourages such attitudes. Hitler instructs the SS Reich administrator to mobilize the last of the reserves.
They used to say, if anyone can scratch together something from the last corners in terms of men, materials and weapons, then Himmler can.
The master race becomes multinational when Waffen-SS continues. Muslims in the Waffen-SS. Himmler is particularly proud of them. They are to hunt down partisans in the Balkans. Being an ethnic German isn't relevant any longer.
And of course, a great many of the old SS would turn up their noses when they saw that Muslims were being accepted into what you might call the blue-eyed elite.
The Waffen-SS has been recruiting all over Europe for some time now. There is also a Ukrainian division. Now, only 4 out of every 10 soldiers are from Germany itself. The Waffen-SS is becoming a multiracial army.
Now the masses were being admitted with more and more new divisions established, and the morale simply wasn't what it had been.
December 1944, the last stand in the West. The Allies are approaching the borders of the German Reich. Hitler orders one more offensive. In the Belgian Ardennes, the Waffen-SS has the advantage of surprise on its side.
We were basically the second wave. On December 16th, the offensive began, and we were deployed just before Christmas. We attacked on Christmas Eve. That was the first attack. And it went quite well. The Yanks were quite demoralized too.
It is followed by a few days of victory. And once again, the Waffen-SS leaves a trail of blood across the land. In Stavelo, members of the bodyguard division Adolf Hitler murder civilians. In Malmedy, they shoot American prisoners of war, in some cases with a bullet to the back of the head. Senseless brutality. The advance of the Western Allies, who are far better equipped, cannot be stopped, especially since the Waffen-SS is short of everything.
We were 40 or 50 kilometers inside Belgium, and our petrol tankers had to drive to Cologne to fill up with petrol in the terrible weather. There was 1.5 meters of snow and ice on the roads. It took them 4 days to get there and back.
The losses are immense. What are the men fighting for by this stage? Their Führer? Germany? They fight until they self-destruct.
Each day we blew up one of our tanks. Always the one that was in the worst condition. The driver and the gunner had to submit a report saying which tank we were going to scrap today. And we went on like that until we didn't have any tanks left.
The last chapter. By the end of December 1944, the Waffen-SS is on the way to Hungary. Hitler has ordered the Viking and Death's Head divisions to break through the Red Army siege of Budapest. Budapest is to be the Stalingrad of the Waffen-SS. The city on the Danube, occupied by the Waffen-SS, falls after a siege lasting 7 weeks. The attempt to relieve the units besieged by the Soviet forces fails. Of the 22,000 SS soldiers in the city, 19,000 are killed.
With other defeats, I think it was always possible to blame someone else to some extent, to say the Italians were at fault or the regular army. But Budapest really was a defeat of the SS. The SS had been ordered there to break the siege of the city, and the attempt was a failure.
There are also Waffen-SS units fighting in Budapest that had been involved in mass murder inside Russia. They are afraid the victorious Russians will now take revenge.
I was in contact with some SS men. And one thing they said to me was, yes, things are going badly, but we have to win in the end. We've got such a past record that we can't do anything else except fight to the last man.
Anyone who doesn't fight on puts his life at risk. Court-martial, death sentence, terror applied to their own people.
They were lined up in the square, ropes around their necks. The verdict was read out, and then the barrels were kicked away, and they were left dangling at the end of a rope. And I have to say, at the time, I felt that the swines deserved to hang, because they had stabbed us in the back. In war, you don't give up. You don't sabotage the effort. You do your duty to the very end.
Berlin is sinking under the relentless bombardment of the Russian artillery. But the last of the SS fight on. Some of them are now only defending a delusion.
And then it became a question of conscience. Should we tell our people to get out of here and go home? Or should we keep on fighting a few days longer? And yes, we did what was asked of us in the end. We defended Germany to the very last day because we believed that by doing so we were defending Europe, which we had to do.
The Waffen-SS also fights to the very end in Berlin to keep the Führer alive, even if it is just for a few more days.
A considerable proportion of the last men defending the Chancellery building, and when I left, the Russians had advanced to within 800 meters, were not Germans at all. There were Swedes, Danes, some French as well, I think.
An irony of history. At the end, there were hardly any Germans left in the Guard that was supposed to be a Germanic elite protecting Hitler's life. One of the last defenders in the center of power is a Frenchman.
Wir dachten gar nicht am Tod.
We didn't think about death at all.
Gar nicht.
Only about fighting.
Weiter kämpfen. Wir lebten und
Fighting
kämpften
on.
nur, zu kämpfen.
A prisoner of self-deception.
Treu bis zum
Loyal
Ende.
to the end.
Treu bis
Loyal
zum
to the
Ende.
end.
The end comes behind these walls. In his bunker below the Chancellery, Hitler evades final responsibility. The SS has been robbed of its figurehead.
The core had been removed, you could say. The force that had driven us onwards. And we were afraid of what was going to happen next.
April 1945 at the River Elbe. Thousands and thousands of soldiers fleeing from the Red Army. Among them, men of the Waffen-SS. Who has been involved in war crimes? Who hasn't? We're just soldiers like all the rest, is what most reply.
We never asked what the purpose of it all was, what it was all about. It wasn't like that. We were soldiers and we were given orders and we carried them out.
The men of the Waffen-SS. Soldiers like all the rest, or war criminals? Many of them became criminals, some became victims, and some were chastened by the horrors they experienced.
If I learned a lesson during the war, it is that war is the worst thing of all. And I came back from the war a convinced opponent of war, in any form.
Not many of his former SS comrades would share this view.
I only want to fight in one more war, and that's the war against wars.
One man in 3 died. For what?
It also strikes me as such a terrible thing that so many others didn't come back. And what did they die for in the end? The British can say, we fought for the freedom of Europe, or we fought against a dictatorship, but what were we fighting for, really, in the end? I still have a certain sense deep down that I'm to blame, that I share the blame for the whole catastrophe.
But decades later, few show remorse. The majority still believing in the justness of their cause. I was only obeying orders.
Tonight on the History Channel. Experience the danger.
Everything that could go wrong did go wrong.
Battle the elements.
We lost our sonar.
Discover the truth. Titanic, high tech at low depth. Tonight at 9. on the History Channel.